The sun rises over Gaza, children walk to school, families share breakfast. Life is simple but hopeful. This is Palestine, a land rich in history and culture, a land where resilience thrives amidst adversity. Suddenly, the morning calm explodes. Once again, deafening roar of fighter jets pierces the air. The ground trembles as bombs rain down, turning homes into rubble. The peace is shattered, replaced by the terror of war. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a large-scale attack on Israel, marking a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. This event, however, must be viewed through the lens of the broader struggle that Palestinians have faced for decades under occupation. The coordinated assault by Hamas, which included breaching Israel's heavily fortified border, was an extension of the Palestinian resistance against the ongoing blockade of Gaza, illegal settlements, and years of oppression and displacement. Hamas fighters used a variety of methods, including bulldozers and tunnels, to break through the border, a symbol of the isolation and confinement Palestinians experience daily in Gaza. The barrage of rockets launched at Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, was a response to the constant bombardment and airstrikes Gaza has endured for years, which have targeted civilian infrastructure, killing thousands of innocent Palestinians, including women and children. The infiltration into Israeli towns and military bases by Palestinian resistance fighters aimed to disrupt military operations that continually target Gaza, where Palestinians live under constant threat of violence. The capture of Israeli civilians and soldiers was portrayed by Hamas as an act of resistance, aiming to bring attention to the thousands of Palestinians, including children, who are imprisoned without trial in Israeli jails. These actions are part of a larger context of ongoing resistance by Palestinians against occupation, displacement, and the denial of basic human rights. For Palestinians, this resistance is often viewed as a necessary response to decades of aggression, land theft, and the humanitarian crisis created by the Israeli blockade. It explores the motivations behind Hamas's surprise attack, framed as a response to Israeli military actions, settler expansions, and the desecration of holy sites like the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The attack is contextualized as part of a larger, ongoing struggle for Palestinian freedom rather than an isolated act of aggression. October 7, 2023, a day etched in the memory of every Palestinian. A day that began like any other, but ended with the world forever changed. For on this day, Hamas, the Palestinian resistance group, launched a daring and desperate attack on Israel. The world called it an act of aggression, a provocation. But for the Palestinians, it was a cry for liberation, a last-ditch effort to break free from the chains of oppression. Israel's response was immediate and devastating. Airstrikes rained down upon Gaza, reducing anything in the way. The disproportionate civilian casualties, particularly among women and children, journalists, medical workers, are brought to the forefront. Emotional stories from families who have lost loved ones provide a human face to the statistics. The destruction of homes, United Nations schools and hospitals symbolizes the ongoing struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Since October 7, 2023, more than 10,000 Palestinian children and at least 115 journalists has been killed. This period has become the deadliest for minors and journalists in recent history. Also, media workers facing immense risks while reporting on the ground, including targeted attacks despite being clearly marked as press. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has led to significant destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza. 203+ schools have been destroyed, 32+ hospitals have been damaged or destroyed, 47+ mosques have been destroyed, 3+ churches have been damaged or destroyed. Additionally, the rape of Palestinian prisoners, men, women and children in Israeli detention centers is a deeply disturbing and widely condemned human rights violation. Reports and testimonies from former detainees, human rights organizations, and legal advocates indicate that sexual violence is used as a tool of humiliation, coercion, and psychological torture. This abuse often occurs during interrogations to extract confessions or force cooperation, with victims suffering severe trauma and stigmatization in their communities. Additionally, this abuse has been largely underreported due to fear of retaliation, shame, and the lack of legal recourse within a system that many Palestinians perceive as biased against them. These actions constitute clear violations of international law, particularly the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits such inhumane treatment of prisoners. The world watched in horror as the death toll mounted, the vast majority of them innocent civilians. The attack on October 7th and Israel's subsequent retaliation trigger wider regional tensions. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and other regional actors became involved, further escalating the conflict. Protests erupt across the Arab world and globally, as Palestinians draw attention to their plight. The narrative here emphasizes the global nature of the Palestinian struggle for justice and the widespread international solidarity with their cause. The sky over Gaza turned into a canvas of fire. Israeli fighter jets armed with the latest technology rained down missiles with terrifying precision. Buildings, once symbols of hope and progress, crumbled into dust. The earth shook and the air crackled with the sound of explosions. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the densely populated city. Gaza, already reeling from years of blockade, was transformed into an open-air prison. The borders were sealed, trapping millions of Palestinians within a war zone. Escape was impossible. Survival became a luxury few could afford. Food, water, and medicine, the lifelines of a besieged population, dwindled with each passing day.
Amidst the rubble and despair, a cry for humanity echoed across the globe. The scenes of devastation were heart-wrenching, with entire neighborhoods reduced to ruins. Families searched desperately for loved ones, and the air was thick with grief and uncertainty. Humanitarian aid workers, risking their lives, worked tirelessly to provide relief and support to those in dire need. From the streets of London to the heart of New York City, people of all faiths and backgrounds rallied in solidarity with the Palestinian people. The protests were a powerful display of unity, with diverse crowds coming together to demand justice and peace. Signs and banners carried messages of hope, resistance, and a call for an end to the violence. The global outpouring of support was a testament to the shared humanity that transcends borders and cultures. The images of carnage in Gaza, beamed across the world by news channels, sparked outrage and condemnation. News anchors and journalists reported from the front lines, bringing the harsh realities of the conflict into living rooms worldwide. The graphic footage and harrowing stories of those affected stirred emotions and prompted urgent calls for action. The relentless coverage ensured that the plight of the Palestinian people could not be ignored. Politicians, celebrities, and ordinary citizens alike raised their voices, demanding an end to the bloodshed. Speeches were made in parliaments and public squares, with leaders urging for immediate ceasefires and humanitarian aid. Celebrities used their platforms to amplify the message, joining protests and speaking out on social media. The collective cry for peace resonated across continents, highlighting the urgent need for a resolution to the conflict. Social media became a platform for sharing stories of resilience, of hope, and of loss. People from around the world posted heartfelt messages, shared personal experiences, and spread awareness about the situation in Gaza. Emotional testimonials and videos went viral, capturing the strength and spirit of those enduring unimaginable hardships. The digital solidarity created a sense of global community, united in the pursuit of peace and justice for the Palestinian people.
The lifeline of Gaza, already fragile, now lay in ruins. The relentless bombardment had crippled the already struggling infrastructure. Water treatment plants, power grids, and sanitation systems all lay in ruins. Israel's response was swift and devastating. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, launched retaliatory airstrikes on Gaza, targeting schools, mosques, churches, journalists, children, and civilians. The airstrikes caused extensive damage across Gaza, including residential areas, hospitals, and schools. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in the strikes, and the civilian toll quickly escalated as the conflict continued. While they continue to bomb civilians, Israel has imposed severe restrictions on humanitarian aid entering Gaza. Since the conflict escalated on October 7, 2023, Israel has maintained a blockade on Gaza, restricting the entry of essential humanitarian aid, including food, medical supplies, and fuel. Although limited aid has been allowed in at various points through negotiations, the amount has been insufficient to meet the overwhelming needs of Gaza's civilian population. The blockade has been widely criticized for exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where over 2 million people have been left without adequate food, water, or medical care. According to reports, Israel airstrikes have damaged Palestine's water systems, leaving large portions of Gaza's population without access to clean water. The destruction of water treatment plants, pipelines, and pumping stations, combined with the blockade that restricts the repair of these facilities, has led to a severe water crisis. Many Gaza residents have been forced to rely on unsafe water sources, increasing the risk of waterborne and many other diseases. These actions have drawn widespread international condemnation, with calls for Israel to allow the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid and to protect civilian infrastructure in accordance with international law. But Israel refused to recognize international laws and continue their genocidal agenda. The bombs keeps falling and the suffering continued. Thirst and hunger, the silent killers, stalked the streets of Gaza, claiming their victims slowly, silently, but no less mercilessly. Clean water, once taken for granted, became a luxury few could afford. The ongoing humanitarian crisis takes center stage in this documentary. The blockade, which was already crippling Gaza, is further tightened after the escalation, cutting off vital humanitarian aid. Aid workers describe the challenges of delivering food, medicine, and water to a besieged population, while residents describe the dire conditions they face daily. The destruction of water and power infrastructure has left millions of Palestinians without access to basic necessities. Children are starving to death. International condemnation is discussed, but the focus remains on the plight of the people trapped in Gaza. The situation described violates several principles of international law, specifically regarding the treatment of civilians during armed conflict and the provision of humanitarian aid. Geneva Conventions, 1949. These conventions, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, protect civilians in times of war. Under Article 33, collective punishment is prohibited, and the deliberate targeting or cutting off of essential services, such as water, food, and medical supplies to civilians, could be considered a form of collective punishment. The destruction of critical infrastructure, especially when it directly affects civilians, can also violate Article 53, which forbids the destruction of property unless absolutely necessary for military operations. Customary international humanitarian law, IHL, Rule 55 of IHL obligates parties in a conflict to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. Cutting off humanitarian aid, food, water, and medicine would breach these obligations. Rule 14 also emphasizes that starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is prohibited. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ICCR, Article 11 recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. Cutting off access to basic necessities as described would infringe on this right. UN Security Council resolutions. Various resolutions have called for the protection of civilians during conflicts, especially in Gaza. The UN Security Council has repeatedly condemned actions that result in humanitarian crises, such as the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure and blockades that prevent access to basic needs. Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court from 1998. Deliberate actions that cause widespread suffering or serious injury to civilians may constitute war crimes. Article 8, 2b, explicitly mentions the act of intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare as a war crime. Therefore, the tightening of the blockade, destruction of infrastructure, and the prevention of humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza could be seen as violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. These actions not only contribute to a humanitarian crisis, but also contradict the legal obligations of conflict parties to protect civilians and ensure their access to life-sustaining resources. Echoes of trauma, scars that run deep. The physical wounds may heal, but the psychological scars of the conflict ran deep. The relentless bombardment, the loss of loved ones, the constant fear and uncertainty, all had taken their toll. Children, their innocence shattered by the horrors they had witnessed, struggled to comprehend the violence that had engulfed their lives. The world turns a blind eye. The international community, as always, responded with a mixture of condemnation and inaction. World leaders issued their now familiar calls for restraint and a return to the negotiating table. But their words rang hollow in the ears of the Palestinians, who had heard it all before. The United Nations, paralyzed by internal divisions, proved once again incapable of effective action. A world's indifference, Gaza forgotten. As the dust settled and the cameras moved on, a sense of weary resignation settled over Gaza. The world had condemned the violence, had pledged aid and support, but had it truly understood the depth of their suffering? The promises of reconstruction rang hollow in the ears of those who had lost everything. The media's lens framing the narrative. The media, once considered the watchdog of democracy and the voice of the voiceless, became complicit in something far darker. As the crisis unfolded, majority of mainstream news networks rushed to cover the conflict, their cameras capturing only the curated fragments of war. But behind the facade of breaking news and frontline reporting, there was a different battle raging, a battle for narrative control. In newsrooms, anchors and reporters worked tirelessly to deliver updates that were carefully crafted and sanitized for the masses. Journalists on the ground, often facing real danger, were frequently constrained by the selective editing and omission of critical context. Meanwhile, producers and editors sifted through hours of footage, not to inform, but to shape a predetermined story. The pressure wasn't to report the unvarnished truth, it was to control public perception. Every frame, every word and every image was filtered through a lens that prioritized the interests of governments and corporations over the real, uncensored realities of war. Beyond traditional news outlets, social media platforms became battlegrounds for competing narratives. Citizen journalists and everyday individuals shared their own stories and perspectives, adding to the cacophony of voices. Hashtags trended, videos went viral, and opinions clashed in the digital arena. The sheer volume of information made it challenging to discern fact from fiction, truth from propaganda. Meanwhile, the printing presses of major newspapers and magazines worked relentlessly, not to inform but to push pre-packaged narratives tailored to suit corporate sponsors and political agendas. Editorial boards, far from debating ethics, often dismissed the responsibility to inform the public truthfully in favor of sensationalism, half-truths, and omission. The real story was buried beneath layers of spin, as the media became a willing accomplice in framing the conflict to fit the preferred narrative of those in power. In this landscape, the media's role as observer was overshadowed by its function as a participant in a well-orchestrated propaganda machine. The battle to control the narrative was not about truth, but about crafting an understanding of the crisis that served the interests of a select few, influencing international opinion and policy in the process. Beyond the headlines, the human cost of conflict. While the world grappled with the political complexities and the media's often conflicting narratives, it was the ordinary people caught in the crossfire who bore the brunt of the conflict. These individuals, whose lives were upended in an instant, faced unimaginable hardships. They were forced to leave behind their homes, their memories, and their dreams, seeking refuge in uncertain and often hostile environments. The resilience of these people, however, shone through the darkest of times. Their stories, often relegated to the back pages or lost amidst the political grandstanding, painted a stark and poignant picture of the human cost of war. Each face told a story of loss, of pain, and of an unyielding spirit. The elderly, who had seen their homes destroyed, clung to memories of a peaceful past. Mothers with tear-streaked faces held their children close, trying to shield them from the horrors that surrounded them. Children, their innocence snatched away by the horrors they had witnessed, bore the invisible scars of trauma. They played amidst the rubble, their laughter a stark contrast to the devastation around them. Yet behind their eyes one could see the weight of their experiences. These young souls, who should have been carefree and full of joy, were forced to grow up too soon. Their haunted expressions spoke volumes about the impact of the conflict on their tender minds. The human cost of conflict is not just measured in lives lost, but in the shattered dreams and broken spirits of those who survive. The international legal efforts to hold Israel accountable for its actions. Also, the ongoing investigations by the ICC and other international bodies into potential war crimes committed by Israeli leaders. It highlights the frustration of Palestinians who feel that despite the mounting evidence of atrocities, justice remains elusive. Legal experts discuss the challenges of pursuing accountability in a world that often prioritizes political alliances over human rights. The International Criminal Court, ICC, has issued applications for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. These applications, filed by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan in May 2024, allege that Netanyahu and Gallant are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly in Gaza, since October 7, 2023. The charges include the starvation of civilians, direct attacks on civilians, and other grave breaches of international law, OI citation, 2. ICC seeking arrest warrants for Hamas leaders and Israel's Netanyahu. However, these applications still need to be reviewed and approved by the ICC's pre-trial chamber before arrest warrants can be officially issued. If approved, the warrants would be legally binding in countries that are members of the ICC. Whispers of resilience, life amidst the ruins. Even amidst the ruins, life in Gaza found a way. The resilience of the human spirit, tested time and again by adversity, refused to be extinguished. We demand justice not just for what has been done, but to ensure that it never happens again. Palestinian lawyer. Seeds of hope rebuilding shattered dreams. From the ashes of destruction, seeds of hope began to sprout. International aid organizations, their efforts often hampered by the ongoing blockade and political complexities, work tirelessly to provide essential supplies, medical care, and shelter to those most in need. Local communities, their bonds strengthened by shared hardship, came together to support one another. A generation rises, the unbreakable spirit. A new generation, born into conflict but not defined by it, rose from the ashes. They had witnessed firsthand the horrors of war, the loss of loved ones, the destruction of their homes and dreams, but they refused to be consumed by hatred or despair. A world's responsibility breaking the silence. The conflict in Gaza, with its heart-wrenching images of destruction and despair, has once again exposed the world's conscience to the plight of the Palestinian people. But as the dust settles and the cameras move on, the question remains, will the world stand idly by, content to offer words of sympathy while the cycle of violence continues unabated? The answer, if history is any guide, is far from certain. Justice delayed, justice denied, the urgency of now. The Palestinian people have endured decades of occupation, displacement and dispossession. Their land has been confiscated, their homes demolished, their lives shattered by a conflict that seems to have no end. Yet, despite the hardships they have faced, their spirit remains unbroken, their hope for a better future undimmed.